What if the famous Moai statues of Easter Island aren't telling us the story we think they are? Standing across the island of Rapa Nui, or more commonly known as Easter Island, are hundreds of enormous stone figures. They're one of the most recognisable statues on Earth. But when you actually look closely at them, some strange questions start to appear. Because not all of the Moai look the same. Some are relatively small, while others are carved on an enormous scale. Some appear much more weathered than others, and some of the most famous images of the Moai only show their heads, because much of their bodies are actually buried beneath the ground, more than 15 feet beneath the surface in some cases. So what's going on? Most of the Moai were carved from volcanic tuff at Rano Raraku, the island's main quarry. And this is where things get really interesting. Scattered around the quarry are unfinished statues that were never completed or transported. And one of them, if it had been finished, would have stood at around 21 metres tall. That's roughly the height of a 7-storey building. So whoever was carving these statues was working on a scale far beyond the famous figures we normally see in photographs. But why were some of the statues left unfinished? And why were others carved so differently? One of the strangest examples is Docrgd. Unlike the familiar Moai standing upright, Docrgd is shown kneeling. It's also made from a different volcanic material, giving it a completely different appearance. So the Moai weren't simply mass-produced copies of one design. There was clearly variation in how these figures were being represented, and that raises another question. Could some of these differences tell us something about how the tradition developed over time? Then there's something you might have noticed in photographs of the island. Some Moai appear to be nothing more than an enormous head sticking out of the ground. But that's not actually the whole statue. Excavations have revealed that some of these figures have full bodies extending beneath the surface, and this completely changes how they look. It also led to one of the most popular theories about the Moai, that they were buried in some enormous catastrophe, perhaps even a flood. Some Moai have even been found underwater, but the question still remains of how they actually got there. But excavation work has shown that at least some of the materials surrounding buried Moai accumulated through natural processes, such as erosion and sediment building up around the statues. But that raises another question. How long would it actually take for 15 feet of sediment to accumulate in some cases? I don't exactly know, but it is very interesting. The fact that these statues were buried for long periods also creates another interesting question. How many of them originally look completely different from the way we see them today? And then there's the erosion. Some Moai look relatively smooth and well preserved, with much of the detail still obvious. Others appear much more weathered. Could this simply be because they were exposed to different environments? Or could differences in weathering potentially tell us something about when or how these statues were made? Whatever the answer, erosion can still tell archaeologists something about the statue's history, particularly whether certain weathering happened before or after it was buried. So rather than simply looking at one statue and saying this one looks older, we can ask a much better question. What happened to these statues before they ended up where we find them today? And there's another detail I find particularly interesting. Look closely at the hands. The Moai typically have their arms running down their bodies with their hands positioned around the lower torso. Now compare that with some of the ancient figures from places such as Göbekli Tepe and Navali Chori. Some of those figures also have their hands positioned across the lower part of the body. So are these connected? Another strange similarity I've noticed whilst researching Easter Island is a particular wall and the way it's constructed. Here in this old black and white photograph you can see these massive blocks very tightly locking together, almost resembling some of the polygonal masonry found in Peru, Bolivia and Egypt. I did cover the similarities between construction methods of the polygonal walls found across Peru, Bolivia, Egypt, Italy and Japan in a previous video. So if you're interested, check that one out on my channel. However, there's absolutely no established evidence linking the people of Rapa Nui with the Neolithic cultures of the Near East, or the high altitude region around Lake Titicaca. And the similarities could simply come from different cultures independently developing similar ways of presenting the human body and building structures. But these are still interesting visual comparisons nonetheless. Why does this particular pose appear in completely different ancient cultures? Coincidence? A common artistic convention? Or does the position have some deeper symbolic meaning that we're simply not understanding? And then we get to one of the biggest questions surrounding the Moai. How were these enormous statues moved? For years, people assumed they must have been dragged across the island, But experimental archaeology has demonstrated that groups of people could potentially move some Moai using ropes and a walking technique, rocking the statue from side to side. But there's still another problem. How were these enormous statues actually extracted from the quarry and prepared for transport? This creates an even more interesting thought. These people weren't just capable of carving enormous stone figures, they developed ways of transporting them across a volcanic island without modern machinery. And perhaps that's the real mystery of the Moai. That an isolated society developed an extraordinary tradition of stone carving, engineering and monument building, and then left behind hundreds of these enormous figures. Some finished, some abandoned, some buried, some damaged, some underwater, and some unlike anything else on the island. So when you look at the Moai, are you looking at one statue from one civilization? Or are you looking at the remains of a tradition that changed dramatically over generations? And how much of that story have we already lost? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please drop a sub and a like to unlock more of your curiosity.